So we've already looked at a number of aspects of religious practice, and some of the things we're going to be looking at today will build on the aspects of religion that we saw in basic religion. So we're going to be looking at a theory of religious organization called the dimensions of religion, or the six dimensions of religion. Now, Ninian Smart, who was the person who came up with this theory, was a very important person in the study of religion, and he originally had six dimensions. He added one, perhaps because seven is a sacred number. As you know, it's the number of days in creation. If you're looking at the Old Testament, it also is a prime number, which is obviously only divisible by one, which is a symbol of unity. And this is the reason why seven has a sacredness to both mathematicians and to religious people. So the two questions I want you to think about as we go through this is, which of these dimensions is most critical in the development of religion as it begins to emerge into a more fully iterated product. Iterated basically means fully formed. And which of the dimensions is most critical in the formation of the religion? In other words, which one comes first? So which one comes first? And then the second question is, which one is the kind of the key to kind of pulling it all together? Those are the questions I want you to think about as we go through this. So Ninian Smart, as you see over on the right, has a high forehead, beautiful high forehead, I have to say. Clearly a sign of his great looks and incredible intelligence. Again, he was a Scottish professor and a guy who became famous because of this theory. So it must have some power to it. So the ritual dimension, we'll start with the ritual dimension. We've already talked about the ritual dimension a little bit. And the ritual dimension is the way in which a community of believers reenacts its myths and stories and confirms and expresses its belief through action. And if you think about one example, for example, Christians routinely go through the ritual of communion, and communion is reenacting the story of the Last Supper. And so as you are taking the blood and body of Christ into your own body, you are reenacting the story of the disciples in their direct connection to Jesus. So it is getting you closer, both literally and symbolically, to the source of your worship. So rituals are very important. They are repeated and they are sacred. Now, when we talk about mythology, we're not talking about mythology in terms of stories that aren't true. We're talking about myths in terms of sacred stories that are passed down from generation to generation, usually begin in the oral tradition. And they're sacred because of what they reveal and explain about the tradition. So again, we understand things through stories, and so this mythological dimension is sort of the story dimension, the thing that gives the entire belief system its coherence in a more accessible way. Then we get to the doctrinal dimension. The doctrinal dimension is basically the sets of beliefs and the way that the nature of the divine or ultimate reality, the relationships of humans to that ultimate real divinity is defined. So the doctrine is almost always written, and it comes through that way. So we'll go through some religious examples a little later. The ethical dimension is basically the legal code or the moral code. So when you think about things like the Ten Commandments, that's part of the ethical dimension. The social dimension is effectively the social organization, the way in which the community organizes itself. It could be the church, could be the structure of the church, or the mosque. The way the mosques are organized, if you look at the Catholic Church, the social dimension would include a kind of organizational aspect too. So the bishops, the cardinals, the parish priests, so forth. Finally, the experiential dimension is probably the easiest one to think about because it's just the way in which prayer and ritual and worship evoke feelings. And so it's either the direct feeling of connection to God through faith or some sort of personal connection. So examples of this, starting with ritual, we mentioned communion before, forms of repeated prayers, ritual, circumcision for Jewish boys is a ritual, which connects you back to Abraham and the faith that he showed in God. The reenactment of the crucifixion in the Philippines, they do this every Good Friday. They actually literally crucify somebody for 5 minutes. I believe the same man has been crucified over 30 times in the Philippines. I don't think that's, it's a pretty intense form of ritual. The Hajj is also a ritual which also involves performative action, which again, these are things that you have to do. Rituals involve doing things. Other examples of culturally specific rituals, many of them involve rites of passage. So if you look at the bullet ant gloves, this is a pretty intense ritual where you have to put your hands into gloves with stinging ants. The Fulani whip match, again, another example of having to endure pain. Throwing babies off of temples in India as forms of trust to the community. So it's engaging in these ritual acts of sacrifice. So you think about elements of rituals, they are sacramental. They transform the ordinary into the sacred. They involve performance, they involve repetition, and they create social cohesion. Mythologies, as we said, sacred stories. So the story of the angel Gabriel coming to Mary to announce the arrival of Jesus, the Immaculate Conception. Mary conceives without relations with her husband, so it's a direct conception by God, central to the mythology of Christianity. In Judaism, you have the central story of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt into Israel, which is the story of their liberation and also their formation as an independent nation and people, and ultimately religion. You have the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, the story of the Buddha's life, which is the core mythology as well. You'll notice that in that case, it's also connected to doctrine, because the way that he lives his life comes to the way he comes to his truths, which is the doctrine of Buddhism. In Hinduism, Arjuna and Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita is the story of how Vishnu, in the form of Krishna, who you can see on the right, reveals himself to Arjuna, and it's about how we can understand the way to get to God. Doctrines are, as I said before, written things that get to either how you should behave or how you should practice your religion. So the Holy Bible is an example, the Quran is one, the Upanishads and the Torah. These all include the moral codes and rituals as well in them. So they're sort of the things that pull it all together in written form. The material dimension, the last dimension, which is the seventh dimension, is basically the things that you find where the religion actually is or how it expresses itself. So the church is an example of material dimension, or a mosque would be the buildings, the sculptures, the crosses, crucifixes, artwork, anything involving architecture or the actual pieces of the religion in physical form. So I want you to go back to the original questions that I asked you, which are here. What's the most critical in the development of the religion, and what's the most critical in the formation of the religion? And then the last thing I want you to do, which is connected to these two things, is I want you to put them into relationship with one another. So I want you to think about historically the order in which they developed, or dynamically how they work in relationship to one another. So whichever one is clearer to you, whichever way you think about it. So I want you to put it in kind of a schematic, a picture or a drawing which explains how all of these 7 dimensions work in concert. So good luck with that, and we will follow this up in class.